Good afternoon. This is Political Economy and its Future. And in this class, I'll try to give you a first sense of the direction in which I propose to take this course. We'll meet here on Mondays during the teaching semester from 1 to 3. I will begin class each time 10 minutes after the hour at 1:10. So 1:10 to 3 will be the effective time of the class. Undergraduates will be able to attend a section, a discussion session. Jacqueline is here, will be the teaching assistant and will lead that section. And we'll see as the semester goes on whether I can meet with all the students in the course for more informal discussion than we would have here. This course has two topics. The forefront topic is the alternative futures of the market economy. The organization of the market economy now and what it may next become. And the background topic of the course is the alternative futures of economics, of the study of the economy, whether or not in a form that would now be recognized as economics. And what I propose to do is to say something about each of these topics, the foreground topic and the background topic of the course. What is the market economy? There are many ways of defining it. One way is that the market is a simplified form of cooperation that is impossible when there is no trust and unnecessary when there is high trust. This initial definition already suggests that the market order depends on particular presuppositions and that it has alternative possible institutional forms. And one of its presuppositions, the presupposition to which this initial definition of the market points, is moral. The economies and societies that preceded the ascendancy of the market order were often societies in which insiders treated one another with favor and high trust and denied any trust to outsiders to their in-groups. And some of the great social theorists, like Max Weber, pointed out that one of the presuppositions of the establishment and diffusion of the market order is the generalization of a modicum of trust, a low level of trust among strangers, breaking down this radical contrast between the insiders and the outsiders. And that particular line of variation in the character of the market order has pertinence today because the new vanguard of production, what we sometimes call the knowledge economy, devoted to permanent innovation, has as one of its characteristics that it allows and in fact demands a heightening of the level of discretionary initiative and reciprocal trust required of all participants in the process of production. So these remarks already introduce you to the idea that the concept of a market order is a contested concept, and that its institutional form is indeterminate. But that thesis is far from being an object of consensus in economics or in social thought. One variety of economic thinking that you could label market fundamentalism has as its key premise the idea that the market order has a single natural and necessary form. One version of this idea is the idea that was promoted by economic and political theorists like Friedrich Hayek. And you could characterize it or caricature it in the following way. If Robinson Crusoe traded on his island long enough, he would eventually reproduce through this trading activity the whole system of 19th century German private law. The law of property and of contract and of business association. And that would be the institutional form of a market. The premise is that any system of spontaneous coordination among free and equal economic agents, trading at arm's length, therefore on the basis of a generalization of low trust, has implicit in it a certain legal and institutional architecture. Now, that idea, I want to argue, is in fact false. The market order has no natural and necessary form. It has a plurality of possible forms. And a central analytical premise of much of the argument that I want to develop and discuss with you is this plurality or indeterminacy of the legal and institutional architecture of the market order. In fact, you might say that the single most important analytical achievement of legal thought in the period from the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 20th century was precisely to establish the proposition that the market order has no single necessary, natural, institutional, and legal form. The jurists who developed this idea often developed it against their own initial intentions. That is, in the middle of the 19th century, they set out to show that the market order has a necessary and natural form. And then as they developed this idea, intellectually, analytically, in legal theory, and practically in the application of law, they undermined it to their own surprise. What they discovered, contrary to their initial intentions, is that as you translate abstract conceptions, like the conception of private property or freedom to contract, further down the ladder of concreteness, at each step of the way down toward greater texture, toward more flesh, there are choices to be made. And you cannot resolve these questions simply by referring back to the abstract conception of the market order. Jurists like Oliver Wendell Holmes in the United States established that the response to those questions depends on conflicts of vision and of interest and cannot be resolved by inference from the abstract conception of the market. But this momentous discovery of legal thought has never fully penetrated the discourse of economics, at least of practical economics. And the natural tendency of the economist is still to imagine that a market is a market, property is property, and contract is contract, as if each of these conceptions had a natural form. So the analytic premise of the argument that I'm going to be working out here in the course begins with a contestation of this thesis of the singular, natural, and necessary form of the market order. There are different directions that are possible. And a great deal in society turns on which of these directions we take. Now let me further develop this initial idea by referring back to the abstract notion of a market. I gave an initial definition when I said it's a simplified form of cooperation, impossible when there is no trust, and unnecessary when there is high trust. But now I'm going to approach the problem of the definition of the market order from a different angle. At the most abstract level, the market is a form of decentralization of economic initiative. But even at this most abstract level, completely out of any particular historical context, the idea of a market order has at least two dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of economic decentralization. That is, the number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. And the other dimension is the degree of control, the absoluteness or relativity of the control that each of those agents has over the resources at his command. So the thesis that I earlier labeled market fundamentalism, the idea that the market has a natural and necessary form, seems to depend on the proposition that these two dimensions, the absolute level of decentralization and the absoluteness of the control that each of the decentralized economic agents has over the resources at his command, go naturally and necessarily together. But it seems quite obvious that they don't. They don't go naturally and necessarily together. And one way of showing that they don't go naturally and necessarily together is that one of the ways in which you might want to increase the level of absolute decentralization, the number of agents able to bargain on their own initiative and on their own account, would be to limit the absoluteness of the control. And you could limit it in different ways. You could say the claim on those resources is relative, it has to be shared, or it's temporary. There isn't perpetuity in the control of those resources. There isn't, for example, the right of hereditary transmission of that control. In other words, you might increase one dimension, the dimension of absolute decentralization, by qualifying the other dimension, the dimension of absolute control. Now let me suggest to you a thought experiment, which we'll come back to later in the arguments of the course. And the thought experiment at this moment is simply designed to illustrate the significance of this initial claim, that the two dimensions of absolute decentralization and absolute control don't go naturally and necessarily together. So suppose the following arrangement, far into the future, in an economy, in a market order, not like any of the market orders that now exist. And under this arrangement, all the major productive assets of society, liquid capital, technology, would be vested in funds. And these funds, not acting as instruments of the state, of the central government, not acting as if they were the means of discretionary allocation of resources by some central decision maker, would auction off the productive resources to whoever would be able to assure them of the highest rate of return over a certain period. So there would be a revolving or rotating capital auction. There wouldn't be absolute control by the individual economic agents, who would never have an unconditional and perpetual claim to these resources. And nor would the control be transferred to the state. It would be vested in these independent funds, who would be, let's imagine, subject to some democratic accountability. So we would see what happened. The funds would conduct their capital auction under different regimes, and then we would compare the practical results and see what works better or worse. And we would change the regimes, or we would increase the room given to one kind of regime and diminish the room given to another kind of regime. Now, would this arrangement that I've just described not be a market order? Would it not be a market economy? You might half facetiously describe it as capitalism without capitalists. There would be this decentralized economic system, but there wouldn't be a class or a cadre of people with absolute and perpetual control over the economic resources. Now, would someone like to say something about this thought experiment I just suggested? Whether it is or is not a market order, or whether we should or should not take it seriously as an invitation to discuss the reconstruction of the market order. Yes?
I think what you've described is not something that we need to be too imaginative about in projecting far out into the future. It sort of resembles aspects of our current market.
Yes, this is a curiosity of the thought experiment, right? Some might say this is utopian. It's very far away, it's radical. And others might say it's similar to what already exists. Because under the orthodox theory of finance, a perfectly competitive capital market allocates resources to the most effective, to the most efficient users. That's what's already supposed to happen. And if it doesn't happen, it must be either because there's a localized defect in competition, or a localized defect in the regulatory response to the failure of competition. So they would say, well, that's an approximation. That's simply spelling out what's already supposed to happen. But then, of course, you might say, does it really happen? You might wonder whether this is really what's happening, whether under the regime of the capital markets there really is this revolving allocation of resources to the most productive uses. And then the thought experiment would be a way of testing the realism of the claim made by orthodox finance theory. But one way or another, it's suggesting that it's not obvious what the basic institutional architecture of the market order should be. And that's really the reason for introducing that thought experiment in this context. Would you like to pursue your argument further, or what? In what direction?
I think where I was going to go next is to say that so I actually do think it sort of describes much of how sort of capital markets work relatively accurately, and so to the extent that we think that that we operate in a market order, or that there's a sort of how do I put it? So basically, if we agree that whatever is around us today is sort of describes a kind of like functional market order, then that thought experiment also seems to.
Yeah. So, of course, on the premise of this orthodox finance theory, there, as it were, there's just one spectrum, more or less competition. But there's no dispute about what the basic legal and institutional architecture should be. But of course, the whole point of this thought experiment is to say there is a dispute. And the form in which economic decentralization should occur is not self-evident. Now, pursuing that line, on that line one might say, but what about absolute property? So that's one form of economic decentralization. The premise of absolute property is not something natural. In fact, the normal form of the property right in law, in legal thought, has been its dismemberment, its disaggregation into separate powers. The unified property right, collecting all of the component powers of property in one space, in one power, and vesting that power in one agent, the owner, is an anomaly in the history of law. It's essentially an achievement of the 19th century, of 19th century legal and economic thought. The normal form of property has been its disaggregation. And in the civil law tradition, which after all legally is the dominant legal tradition in the world, we think that the main components of property are possession, physical possession of the resource, of the asset, usufruct, the right to claim the resource stream that results from control, and alienation, the right to buy and sell. And these three powers of possession, usufruct, and alienation may be together or not. And that way of dividing the powers of property is just one form. Now, you might say, defending absolute property, as a vehicle of economic decentralization, absolute property has an advantage. The advantage of absolute property is that it allows someone, the owner, to do at his own risk something that no one else believes in. And that would be a reason why, even if you began to transform the legal architecture of the market, you would not want to abolish private property, absolute private property. You might say it should have a place. It should be one of the forms of economic decentralization because it has this advantage. Frank Knight, a conservative economist of the Chicago School, said, the historical justification of capitalism is the existence of a class of people who are willing to pay a premium for the privilege of running a risk. So that's a justification of the traditional arrangement. But even if you accepted that justification, you might say, but that's not a reason to have absolute private property as the only form of economic decentralization. It could be just one form among many. It would be good for some things and not good for other things. And therefore you would imagine the market having different legal and institutional architectures rather than just a single uniform legal and institutional architecture. Any other comment that someone would like to make about this? Now, this is not a small matter. This is a matter of great consequence. Because what results from this dispute that we're beginning to have here is a conflict over the form of the market. For 250 years or 300 years, the basic premise of ideological conflict in the world has been more market or less market, more state or less state, or some kind of synthesis of state and market. That's supposed to be social democracy or social liberalism. But here the idea that is being introduced is that the dispute may not be about more or less market, it may be about which market. And that's a different dispute. And then you could generalize that in the form of an idea about the nature of ideological controversy in the world, and you could say, now there's a dispute, or there should be a dispute, there should emerge a conflict over the alternative institutional forms of the market order, of political democracy, and of independent civil society. The forms that are now established or available in the world are a subset of a much larger range of possibilities. And the interests of humanity turn on the exploration of the other parts, the parts that have not been realized, that have not been tried out, that have not been imagined. Any more comments about this? Well, yes.
Professor Unger, the idea that there would be, in this auction, minimal control, couldn't there be a presupposition that over time, as that market function works, groups and hierarchies would form to try to scheme for the auction system to win in the competition?
Of course. So
And
it
isn't
could
that-
be, so in other words, that there are groups that would acquire temporary advantage, and then they would try to turn that temporary advantage into vested rights, to render them perpetual or rigidify them. Of course there would be. And that suggests that this experimentation with the market order would have to go in parallel with an experimentation in the form of democratic politics. That if you were to democratize the market order in that way, you have to somehow find a way simultaneously to deepen democracy or energize democratic politics, precisely to prevent the risk that you just noted. So, but it's the same kind of argument that exists. That is, one might then say, just as the market order has a single natural and necessary form, so too democracy has a single natural and necessary form.
But I guess that undermines the indeterminacy argument, because it shows that there's an a priori determinacy argument about deepening democracy in order to counter that trend.
Why does it undermine the indeterminacy argument? Is not that there are no influences, that there's no determination. It's that the determination opens up into a world of possibilities, that there are definite trajectories or definite alternatives, not a single alternative. So it's the same kind of argument you would have about democracy. So a premise of conservative statecraft and legal thought with respect to democracy is that at the end of the day, you have to choose between a politics that is cold and institutional, the politics of Madison, Madisonian constitutionalism, and a politics that is hot and anti-institutional. That's Caesarism, for example. But an opponent of this idea might say, you don't have to choose. You can imagine a politics that is both hot and institutional, a politics in which the institutions elevate the level of organized popular engagement in political life. That would turn on the tails. The electoral regimes, the relation between money and politics, the relation between the political parties or the social movements and the means of mass communication and so forth. But the general idea is that you would want to energize democratic politics and create this third position. And similarly, so you could say, conservative statecraft and legal thought depend on the assumption that there is a natural relation between the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power in the state. There are many seats of power in the state, and the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics through the Madisonian scheme, for example, of checks and balances. Now, the conservative idea is that the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power is indissolubly connected to the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. So one of the objectives of this traditional constitutional scheme is to inhibit the transformation of the basic economic order, the market order, by politics. And you might have it as an objective to reaffirm the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, but to repudiate the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. For example, you might say, if there's an impasse, say, between the president and the Congress in an American-style constitutional system, either power would unilaterally have the prerogative to resolve the impasse by calling anticipated elections. But the anticipated elections would always have to be for both branches, so that the power that exercised the constitutional privilege to resolve the impasse would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. The elections would always be bilateral. The anticipated elections to resolve the impasse would always be for both branches. So you can go part by part and begin to imagine transformations of the institutional machinery of the democratic order. And the extent to which the economic arrangement that we described before, the thought experiment of the capitalism without capitalism would be subject to the degeneration that you described, would seem to depend in part on the political context, which is capable of modification in the same spirit by the same methods. So it's the same kind of argument that would go on, that would be expanded. Its scope would be expanded, but the fundamental nature would be, of the argument would be the same. Now, in our discussions here in the course, this abstract thesis that I've just described, the thesis that the market order can be reinvented, that it doesn't have a natural legal and institutional architecture, is related to a series of fundamental divisions or alternatives in contemporary thought and contemporary politics in the organization and future of the economy. So there are three such divisions which will be important in our arguments here. So the first division concerns the relation of the advanced part of production to the rest of the economy, the rest of the production system. So until recently, until the late 20th century, the most advanced form of production was what we now call conventional industry, or Fordist mass production. The production of standardized, large-scale goods and services by relatively rigid machines and production processes, semi-skilled labor in the context of very hierarchical and specialized relations of production. And that's the background. That's the institutional and legal background to what in the United States are called the Rust Belt industries, conventional industries, declining traditional mass production industry. That's no longer the vanguard of production. There's a new vanguard, which we sometimes call the knowledge economy. It's not to be confused with just the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley, or even just with advanced manufacturing. It exists in every part of the production system, in intellectually dense services, and even in precision and scientific agriculture. But in every part of production, it appears as a fringe, excluding, blocking out the vast majority of workers and businesses. So it is multi-sectoral, but at the same time insular. And this insularity of the vanguard has enormous consequences. First, in the slowing down of economic growth. If the most advanced practice is denied to the majority of workers and their firms, how could one not expect there to be a slowdown? And on the other side, to the aggravation of economic inequality. The inequality is anchored in the structural division between the vanguards and rearguards of production. Vast inequalities. And the traditional device for the moderation of these inequalities, which is compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer, that is to say, by progressive taxation and redistributive social spending, seems incapable of redressing these fundamental inequalities that are rooted in the structure of production. Well, how is one to understand this? Is this something which is necessary? Is it an inevitable consequence of economic evolution? Or does it result from particular institutional arrangements to which there are alternatives? So, under what conditions, including under what institutional conditions, could one hope to create a knowledge economy for the many, and not just a knowledge economy for the few, which is what we have in the world? Presumably there would be institutional conditions, but also educational conditions and social moral conditions. What are they? So this is the first fault line in the struggle to define the alternative futures of the market economy. The relation of the vanguard to the rest. And the conditions under which there could be a socially inclusive vanguardism. Now, a second fault line has to do with the relation between labor and capital. The ascendancy of this new vanguard, the knowledge economy, in its insular form, has been associated throughout the world with the consignment of an increasing part of the labor force to conditions of precarious employment, radical economic insecurity. In the developing countries, in the so-called informal economy, at the fringes of the law, without rights, without protections, and in the rich economies, in the proliferation of unstable employment relations. Unionization declines, and there's no adequate legal protection of the now precarious worker. So then the question there is, under what conditions can free work, free labor, which has historically been one of the premises of the market order, be really free? Now, it's important to remember that up to the middle of the 19th century, the shared premise of liberals and socialists is that economically dependent wage labor was a transient and defective form of free labor, retaining many of the characteristics of serfdom and slavery, and that it must, in the course of time, give way to what the liberals and socialists of that time understood to be the higher forms of free labor: self-employment and cooperation. Those were the higher forms of free labor. And the economic reality of these societies made this seem not like a dream. So when Tocqueville visited the United States in the 1830s, of course, a large part of the country had a slave economy, slavery. But in the other part of the country, the vast majority of people were independent proprietors, artisans, and small tradesmen. In the 1830s, when Tocqueville came, only one white man in 5 worked for another white man. So that was a country in which this petty production, petty commodity production, as the Marxists came to call it, was a major feature of the economic order. And so it didn't seem unrealistic to suppose that the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation, would come to prevail. But there was a problem that the liberals and socialists of that time were unable to solve. And the problem was how those higher forms could be reconciled with the relentless imperative of the aggregation of resources at scale in a dynamic contemporary economy. And it seems that the solution to that problem would have required a solution to the problem we discussed before, which is the reorganization of the basic legal and economic architecture of decentralized access to the means of production, to productive resources and opportunities. It couldn't just be the singular form of the absolute property right. Otherwise, there'd be no way of reconciling self-employment and cooperation with this aggregation of resources. So the question is, in what form and by what means does free work, free labor become really free? And what are the alternatives? Now we come to the third line of division, the third fault line. The third fault line to discuss is the relation of finance to the real economy, which we were addressing before in our argument just now about the implications of orthodox finance theory. So let me mention three enigmas which show why this is problematic, and that are all tied together in some complicated way. Three enigmas about the relation between finance and production in these contemporary economies. Under the current arrangements, the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. Every empirical study that has been conducted has shown that well over 80% of the funding of production is generated internally in the production system itself. What then is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? What is it for? Aside from facilitating consumption. Theoretically, it's to serve the productive advent of society. But it doesn't seem to be related to that at all. The system of finance has an oblique or episodic relation to the financing of production. For example, initial public offers. But they're an accident. They're a sideshow. They're not the real thing. So then the second enigma is that in good times, finance seems to be indifferent to production, to the production system. And in bad times, it becomes a disaster. So there's this asymmetry, in which it doesn't seem very effective to do good, but it seems very effective to do evil. The third enigma is in some ways the most interesting. The third enigma is that what would seem to be the most important social responsibility of finance, to fund the making of new assets in new ways, represents in fact a minuscule part of the activity of the capital markets. That's venture capital, or the kindred forms to venture capital. It's a tiny part of the capital markets. Even in those countries, like the United States or Israel, in which venture capital is well established. It's a tiny part. So why is the most important thing entirely marginalized? So there's financial hypertrophy. Finance gobbles up a huge part, not just of profit, but of human talent in the society. And what does it give in return for this devouring of capital and human life? So this leads to the question how finance could be enlisted in the service of the productive agenda of society more effectively. And the starting point for that investigation, for that inquiry, would be a simple practical proposition. The practical proposition is that the best way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful. Now, how would you make it more useful? Under what conditions? Under what conditions could you deepen the relation of finance to the real economy, to production, rather than simply encouraging this hypertrophy of finance, in which finance is an albatross around the neck of the production of societies, sometimes called financialization. So these are then the questions that emerge that result from the dispute about the alternative directions, the alternative futures of the market order. Now, would someone like to comment or question this? This is just a projection of a future conversations. Yes.
I have a question about the second point on the relation between labor and capital. I'm not entirely sure that I understand whether the ideal in this case would be small and medium enterprises. Is it a matter of scale?
You mean on the discussion of labor and capital?
Yeah, because when we say...
No, not at all, not necessarily. Not necessarily. So, one way to answer your question is to recur to the example of the Yugoslav system. So there was once in the West the idea that the solution was to make the workers collectively owners. So there would be worker self-management and worker ownership. Now, as soon as you establish that principle, the following dilemma arises. So you say, absolute property will continue to exist, but now instead of transferring it from the workers to the government, to the state, from the capitalists to the state, you'll transfer it to the collective labor force of the firm. Now, presumably, some firms will prosper, others will decline. What will you do? Will you say that the firms that prosper can buy up the failed firms and consign their workers to a lower level, like second-class economic citizens? They'll be wage workers. of the prosperous new class of worker owners? Or will you impose restraints on alienation? Say, no, they can't do that. They can't buy up other firms. They can't accumulate. They can't restrict other workers to a second class. These are the problems that arose in the classical disputes about agrarian reform over a 2,000-year period. To preserve it, the status of petty property, you would have to impose draconian restraints on alienation. And either of these options seems destructive for different reasons. So you have to figure out a different way of designing the property right, which would make it possible to avoid these two options. That goes back to the discussion of the capital auction that we were having before. So the issues are all connected. That's why I said that the inability to reconcile the ideal of self-employment or cooperation with economies of scale proved to be fatal in that 19th century notion that wage labor, economically coerced labor, wage labor, is a transient and defective form of free work. So this is just beginning to evoke a dispute, which after all, you're all witnesses to this. This dispute doesn't even exist in the world. You might think it should exist, it's a natural dispute, but it doesn't exist. It's not a dispute that exists, and there's some complicated relation of the ideas to the political alternatives. Why are these alternatives that I'm now introducing here in our discussion, why are they not live alternatives? Why are they not living alternatives? Why is this like a theoretical entertainment rather than a living political dispute? And that so then brings me to this question. In listing these three fault lines, the relation of the vanguard to the rest, the relation of labor to capital, and the relation of finance to the real economy, to production, I am simply designing a series of possible controversies which have not yet become real or have not yet taken definite form, either ideologically and programmatically or politically in real politics. And so now I have to ask this other question. In what way or by what means would this become real? So there's a real conflict in the world. There's a real objective. The most widely professed objective in the world is to promote socially inclusive economic growth. And the societies that are seen as successful are societies that have undergone growth miracles. Over the last 250 years, every society that is now rich went through such growth miracles. And one of them was the United States in the first half of the 19th century, from the independence to the Civil War. And in retrospect, we can see that the growth miracle had a particular form. There was a developmentalist project of large-scale mobilization of physical human financial and economic resource. That was the Hamiltonian project. All the presidents of the United States, down through Abraham Lincoln, regarded themselves as disciples of Alexander Hamilton, who was the ideologist of national construction. This was the forced opening up of the United States, the creation of it. There was a nascent plutocracy, an oligarchy, cadre politicians and bureaucrats and adventurers who profited from this. One of their instruments was the Bank of the United States, the then National Bank. But this project of mobilization would not have achieved the effect that it achieved if it had not interacted with something else. And this something else was in the North, the economy of the petty artisans or entrepreneurs that I described before. The selective democratization of the American economy in what were then the two crucial sectors of agriculture and finance. So in agriculture, the Americans rejected what at that time was seen by both the right and the left as inevitable: agrarian concentration, the creation of consolidated large land holdings, the expulsion of the petty farmers and peasants from the land. They distributed the land on the agrarian frontier. Those were the Homestead Acts. They organized a strategic partnership between the government, national and local governments, and the family farmer. They brought the achievements of agricultural science to the door of the farmer through the land-grant colleges. And they organized the whole economic basis of family-scale agriculture. Because family-scale agriculture is uniquely susceptible to a combination of climate volatility and economic volatility. So you needed to have food stockpiles, price guarantees, agricultural insurance, and so forth. These are all a creation. So they created the most efficient form of family-scale agriculture that had ever existed in the world up to that point. Family-scale agriculture with entrepreneurial attributes. And similarly, in finance, there was a conflict that came to a head in the presidency of Andrew Jackson. And the Americans, for over a century, they dissolved the National Bank, and they prohibited any bank from operating in more than one state of the Union for over 100 years. Only at the end of the 19th century, the New York banks began to become de facto national banks. So they created the most decentralized system of credit that had ever existed in the world up to that point. That was a democratization of the relation between finance and production. Now, when the Americans did this in agriculture and in finance, they were not regulating the capital market or the agricultural market, and they were not compensating through redistributive social spending and progressive taxation for the inequalities generated in the market. They were doing a third thing, which is much more important than compensatory redistribution or regulation. They were reinventing the market in those sectors. They were creating a form of market in agriculture and in finance that had never existed before, with a completely different institutional architecture. That was much more important. That was dealing with the structural issues. And so a basic element in the creation of the United States was this interaction between the developmentalist project on top, the Hamiltonian project, and this selective democratization in the two groups. Now, why did that stop, you could ask later? Why did it become progressively weaker in later moments of American history? That's another discussion. But this is just to give a particular example of a growth miracle. That was the basis of the making of the United States. In Japan, in the middle of the 19th century, the Meiji Restoration, they redesigned things, they seized power. And if you look at the construction of these growth miracles, then they all involved a combination of mobilization of resources on a large scale. All of them were, in a sense, war economies without a war. And at the same time, institutional innovation. Innovation in the institutional arrangements of the market order. And what about now? What's the situation in the world? So, taking these historical examples of growth miracles, what would be required now for this practice to be generalized in the world and reignited even in the now rich countries? It seems that from the standpoint of the social agent who does this, two things are paramount. First, there has to be a counter-elite. In each of these societies, there was part of the elite dissented and struggled for power in the name of both a productivist and a nationalist idea. So a productivist and a nationalist counter-elite. Associating its cause with the strengthening of the nation. But of course, the main task of the counter-elite is not simply to give orders. The counter-elite has to build support in the country. And it has to approach the mass of ordinary people and win part of their support. And what about this mass today? What is the dominant characteristic? So most people in the populous countries of the world now are poor and disorganized. But their characteristic aspiration is petty bourgeois. It's the dream of the small business class. What do most people in the world desire? Is to have a small plot of land, a little farm, a shop, a way of providing petty qualified services and so forth. It is the dominant dream of most of humanity now is this archaic, relatively unproductive family business, isolated, regressive. And we know from the nature of family business throughout the world, largely dependent on self-exploitation and family saving. So what would the nationalist and productivist counter elite have to do? It would have to approach this mass, the majority, and offer it an alternative to its default dream of isolated, backward-looking family business. So the aspiration to modest prosperity and independence would have to be honored, but given an alternative form of fulfillment, which had a horizon to the future to open. And that relates then to the earlier discussion about a knowledge economy for the many. So these theoretical, apparently theoretical or abstract disputes, the fault lines that I listed, would come to life in the heat against the background of this struggle. And I'm making a causal claim here, a historical claim, which is now that the majority, with the most plausible claim to represent the interests of humanity, is not Marx's industrial proletariat. That's a tiny minority. But this vast majority, which you could describe as the subjective petty bourgeoisie. In other words, why do I say subjective petty bourgeoisie? Objectively, they're not members of the small business class. The vast majority remain poor. But subjectively, they participate in the petty bourgeois dream. And so what is the path forward for them? It depends on a growth miracle, but the growth miracle has to have certain characteristics to make socially inclusive growth possible in the present epoch. So that's an anticipation of what I want to suggest would be the condition under which those apparently just theoretical debates about the alternative forms of the market economy would come to life and acquire practical potency. Now, before I go forward, would someone like to comment on this? Yes.
I just have a question. You said there were, you asked how could this happen, and you said there were two things. One is the rise of the counter elite, and then you described what conditions would be
That's right. I'm trying to picture the practical agency of these alternatives.
Right.
And I'm saying that who is the agent? Because after all, the philosopher can say this should happen, that should happen. But then you ask, but who will do this?
So are the two agents the counter elite and the sort of subjective petty?
And the subjective petty bourgeoisie, converted, persuaded to go beyond the default expression of its ambitions. Huh? And then, of course, you can ask, what's the counterpart to this in the rich countries, like the United States? And I think there is a counterpart, but that's a subject for discussion. You know? So, the breakout from the insular knowledge economy, from this divided and exclusive form of productive vanguardism, has to be a real social process. And then you have to ask the same question of the agents and who they could be. So in these societies now. There's a widespread experience of dispossession by the majority. And they feel abandoned and victimized. Their putative representatives were the social democrats, the social liberals, who have had no response to this insular character of the new vanguard, to the consignment of labor to radical economic insecurity, to the subversion of production by hypertrophied finance. No response. Those would be the elements of a broad, popular, and productivist project. It's that project that hasn't come to life in most of these rich countries. Now, there's one more subject we have to address, as if this weren't enough, and that's the future of economics itself. The methods by which we would study all of this. And this is, of course, a very complicated subject. And I will say only a few words. It's the background subject. Forefront is the alternative futures of the market order. The background subject is the alternative futures of economics. But what is economics? Let's start with that. Economics now in the world is not the study of the economy, as you might suppose it to be. Economics is the study of a method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. The application of that method to subjects that on their face have nothing to do with production and exchange is regarded as economics. And the study of economics by some other method, like for example, the social theory of Max Weber, is not regarded as economics. So economics is not the study of the economy, it's a study of that method. The economics departments of the American research universities now have an absolute lock, a stranglehold on the worldwide agenda of economics. So they represent this orthodoxy, and it is now disseminated throughout the world. And it makes it very hard to study these things, which I tried to begin discussing earlier in this introductory class. Now, the common popular criticisms of economics are dismissed by the economists, and I think very reasonably dismissed, because they're based on a complete misunderstanding. So, for example, that economics presupposes the rational maximizing agent, presupposes a fictional character doesn't really exist, that it imagines free competition or this or that. The economists shrug their shoulders and say, it's ridiculous. That's not what we think, and justifiably. So the criticisms of economics that are legitimate have nothing to do with these popular conceptions. And what are they? So the first is that in the economics that resulted from the marginalist turn at the end of the 19th century, there is a dissociation between formal analysis and causal inquiry. The economy is pictured as a connected set of markets and viewed from the standpoint of the individual seeking to maximize his satisfactions against a background of comparative scarcity. The Austrian economists, and that was one of the variations or sides of this economic theory at the end of the 19th century, correctly understood that this economics was not intended to be a causal science. It was like a form of logic in which the fundamental moves are the moves of deductive reasoning. You picture the situation of competitive selection or competitive equilibrium, and then you recognize that there are departures from that idealized situation, but it functions as a heuristic that allows you to understand the situation as not meant to describe it. And then the heuristic is very useful. So the way it functions is that this economics is, it's like a discipline which is charged with presenting the bill. So you want this, you want that, everything has costs. Everything depends on a comparison of costs and benefits. We come afterwards and we rigorously force you to confront the constraints and the trade-offs. And what the economist does then is he creates, against this background of this logic, this quasi-logic, models. And the models are simplified presentations of the circumstances that exist in the world. And if the model fails to explain the situation, the economist replaces that model with another model. At no point is the underlying theoretical picture in jeopardy, because the underlying causal theoretical picture was never a causal conjecture to begin with. It was this quasi-logical method. So the science proceeds by the replacement of models, one model by another, with the replacement of the models never placing in jeopardy the underlying theoretical conception. And that's regarded as an advantage. But it's not really an advantage for science, because it means that the science can't progress the way that empirical physical science has progressed. And this also explains another strange feature. You know, this economics, the economics that results from marginalism, reveres mathematics. It has a reverential attitude to mathematics. But there's something strange, which is that almost all of the mathematics that it uses is like toy mathematics. Almost all of the mathematics used in economics was invented before the middle of the 19th century. It's essentially calculus and variations. There's no higher mathematics in economics. So why do they revere it and then practice it in a primitive form? The answer is that's all that makes any sense, because the purpose of mathematics in this economics is to express deductive reasoning. And that's all the mathematics they need. There's no use for any other mathematics. Mathematics that's required for quantum theory or for relativity would be useless in economics. So there's a lot of formal analysis, and there's a lot of descriptivism of particular situations, but they have almost nothing to do with each other. There's no dialectic, there's no interrelation between the theory and the empiricism. They're separate quantities. And the science, if it is a science, kind of pseudoscience, is condemned to a kind of eternal infancy by failure to establish this dialectic. The second defect of this economics is its deficiency of institutional imagination. And the most important deficiency is the one we discussed earlier today. Its deficiency in imagining the alternative institutional forms of the market itself. And the extreme form of that is what you could describe as market fundamentalism. The idea that I joked about earlier in the class. Robinson Crusoe trades on his island, and he eventually recreates a system of German private law. It's implicit in the system of spontaneous coordination of free and equal agents. So from this standpoint, you can say there are three varieties of economics. There's pure economics, rigorous marginalism that makes no institutional assumptions and has no institutional consequences. For example, in the middle of the 20th century, it was established that the methods of marginalist economics could be applied to the description of decisions in a command economy just as well as in a market economy, if they were conducted with sufficient rigor. That's pure economics. It's invulnerable, but at the same time impotent, because it's like an analytic machine that operates with the fuel of institutional assumptions or empirical assumptions that are supplied to it from the outside. Then there's a second kind of economics, fundamentalist economics. It's this one that I attributed to Hayek and his school. And it says the market has a very particular order, and so it then becomes potent by becoming superstitious. And then there's a third kind of economics, illustrated by the discursive and argumentative practice of the American Keynesian or post-Keynesian economists, the so-called macro economists. The object is to discuss law-like relations between large-scale economic aggregates, like the level of employment and the level of inflation. And they'll try and establish a law-like relation, saying, for example, that a certain level of inflation or of disinflation is related or not to a certain level of employment. The objection that's made is then that this so-called law-like relation always depends on a host of particular institutional assumptions. So, for example, take the Phillips curve, the so-called Phillips curve that supposes this law-like relation between inflation and employment. Now, if you change any of the features of the institutional background, whether or not the workers are unionized, how they're unionized, what their rights are, who controls monetary policy, and so forth, you change the law-like relation. So What is claimed to be a law-like relation is simply the artifact, the product of all these presuppositions being in place, institutional stagnation. And if in fact the institutional arrangements are all in place, then you can disregard the dependency of the law-like relations on them and say, begin to confuse the stability with lawfulness. So you make the concession, you say, yes, indeed, theoretically it does depend on all those presuppositions. But given that none of them is changing because we live in an institutionally stagnant society, we can disregard that and go back to our prior analytic and argumentative practice. Now, so, dissociation of causal inquiry from formal analysis, deficit of institutional imagination. The third defect of this economics is that it has no view of production. Tantamount to its view of competitive selection. Its view of exchange, the price system. So for the two greatest economists in the history of economics were Adam Smith and Karl Marx. And both of them had a theory of production, which was at the same level as their theory of competitive selection, of exchange. But that's not what happens in this economics. The view of, if you open an economic textbook, there'll be a chapter called production, or the theory of production or something. It will have nothing to do with what I'm calling production here. We've got the form of the market, the substitution of one factor of production for another under certain conditions, and so forth. So production appears as a shadowy extension of the system of exchange, facilitated by a contingent feature of these economies, which is that in them, labor can be bought and sold. And so it's much easier as a result of the fact that labor can be bought and sold to picture the whole organization of production as an extension of the system of relative prices. The fourth defect of this economics can be understood best by an analogy to the situation in the life sciences. So you know, in the life sciences, there is a theory of competitive selection. It's the Darwinian theory of natural evolution. And there is a theory of the creation of the diverse stuff on which the method of competitive selection operates. And that's a theory of genetic recombination and mutation. So the neo-Darwinian synthesis in the life sciences depends on the combination of these two bodies of ideas. Here, in economics, we have a theory of competitive selection with the other half missing. There's no theory of the creation of the diverse stuff on which the method of competitive selection operates. It's a given. It's a point of departure. In fact, from the standpoint of this economics, the division of the world into sovereign states that can organize themselves in different ways is an inconvenience or an embarrassment because it greatly increases transactions costs. Why not just have a unified world economy, a world state? There's a theory of competitive selection with no corresponding theory of the creation of the diverse stuff on which the method of competitive from which the method of competitive selection selects. Now, actually, all of this that I said is just a twist on a fundamental feature of the intellectual situation. The central object of inquiry in social and economic thought is the structure of society. The highest object of practical ambition in politics is the preservation or the transformation of the regime. And the highest object of theoretical ambition in social theory is the explanation of what regimes are and how they change. And now we have in these social sciences, in the contemporary social sciences, a cutting of the vital link between the understanding of the actual and the imagination of the adjacent possible. The way you understand anything is by understanding what it can become. That's what it means to understand. If you don't understand the accessible transformations of a phenomenon, you don't understand it, period. But in these contemporary social sciences, on the whole, you have a severing of the vital link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible. But each social science does it in a different way. Economics does it in a unique way, the way that emerged from this marginalist transformation. The marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century, living in a period of intense political and ideological conflict, wanted to create an invulnerable science, a science that would be invulnerable to logical and normative dispute, and that's what they did. So what can our situation be? So we have to use this economics because there is no other economics really, and get from it what we can. But we have to understand at the same time its limitations and struggle to develop the elements of a different understanding of economic life and of its transformative possibilities. Very difficult. And the real subject of political economy ultimately is a spiritual subject. The subject is the embodiment of spirit in the material life of humanity. Spirit is, so we human beings, we're shaped by context, we're shaped by these regimes, by these orders. But there's always more in us, in each of us individually, and in all of us collectively, humanity, than there is or ever can be in them. We transcend. That's the implication of the use of the word spirit. And what we should want is for our material life to do justice to this spiritual condition. And thus, to my mind, the study of political economy has to be conducted in a way that is at once practical and prophetic. That's actually all I wanted to say today. It's quite a lot. And are there any questions or comments that you'd like to make? You still have a few minutes if you'd like. Yes.
Question about something you said. You said that for the last 200-300 years, the primary source of conflict in the world has been sort of around the question of more market or less market, and that maybe there should also be a question around like what kind
The
of
dominant model of ideological conflict, that's been the model, been a hydraulic model of ideological conflict.
I was just curious.
More market, less state, more state, less market, compromise between market and state, as if what a market was given, and the only question that remained was to have more of it or less of it.
I do.
Huh? So we'll continue next week. Internally the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic, published back in 2013. My understanding. So there's capital investment, or proxies, excessive rate.
I'm willing to believe something in that direction. And I wonder how it's evolved.
Actually, the figures that I saw, and it makes sense. Now the large firms are sitting on balance sheet, and they approach the capital markets, not in search of funding, but in search of business. They play the markets with their liquid capital. So I think the more common objection is dismissing the role of finance in the funding. And of course, it's the whole thing. So that's the way you can
And that being
not the perspective. But I think that's extremely interesting. So, he says, so how does the inflation, you could say, well, the most tangible way is initial public offering. Then there's a thesis, that's the episodic relation. The oblique relation is to say, it establishes the stock market, establishes a benchmark of value, which allows the companies theoretically to borrow on those stock if they were to borrow. But in fact, they don't borrow. So, what's the point of all of that? What's it for?
layers of more entrenched.
On that point, I would be careful in following. This argument does not generate an attack on speculation per se, because you can say the speculative element of finance is useful, generating information and organizing the allocation of risk. The problem is not the speculative element of finance. The problem is the dissociation of financial speculation from a productive horizon. That's the problem.
Yes, and I think what I was suggesting was that, let's say they work with all kinds of derivatives, that derivative markets. Many of which did not exist 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Correct. And by the way, our whole idea of derivatives, of financial derivatives, and the organization of markets, is a practice practical illustration of the dismemberment of the property. Because technically, financial derivatives are derivatives of the property right. They're taking out components of unified property and creating a market. That's what they are. But that's restricted to finance. But the same principle could be applied all over.
I'm saying that those are evidence of further distance from the productive uses.
In the way in which they practice, but they wouldn't have to be.
That's fair.
The principle,
In fact.
the creation of derivatives and markets and derivatives could be an element of a productive program.
Yes, that's just not how
That's not how it happened.
it happened.
Yeah.
I worked in public markets over the summer and going into that world. There's very little.
So then you have increasing layers of financial engineering in which the initial transaction of real economy becomes a pretext for the success of layers more than the topic itself. So each layer is about the other layer, but not about what started it all.
Thanks.
Good.
Hi, I'm Joshua.
Hello.
I saw, I've been reading a little bit of like Michael Hudson last year, and I saw him like reference in the American Affairs Journal. But like an idea of his that kind of reminded me of what we were talking about in class is like when we calculate GDP, when you talk about how like finance is like 20% of it is related to the real economy, but 80% isn't. Like the way we would calculate GDP is we add all of that, the GDP versus just like adding the 20% and maybe even like subtracting the 80% for being like extracting rent or being like parasitic, I guess, in a way, the economy. So I don't know. I just made that connection.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. It's absolutely true that all of these theoretical or ideological disputes leave a trail in the nomenclature and terminology.
Right.
The nomenclature of the national accounts is all biased to suppress the issue of credit. But this was in moments in American history. And I'm going to open. For example, Alfred Chandler, the man who founded General Motors, he said, the purpose of General Motors is to make money. Henry Ford answered it. The purpose of our company is not to make money, it's to make cars. And it's a very simple dispute about what the real object was.
Right. And I think like one of the readings it talked about how like increasing competition doesn't always make capital more productive. Like you can, it might just increase like rent extraction by like,
Could, of course.
yeah.
Of course, it all depends on the context.
Right. Interesting stuff. And then when you talked about how like sort of absolute ownership could like coexist with like common ownership, I guess, it reminded me of ideas behind like land socialization or land taxation, where like even if you were to like do a land value tax or something and hold like weekly auctions,
So that was a somewhat different idea. There, when I
it's not
referred to the
capital, I
property
guess.
right,
Yeah.
I presented the question of the relation of traditional property to the capital. The notion was you can organize the economic decentralization in several ways, which aren't necessarily contradictory. So you can say the absolute property right has a utility. The utility I described allows someone to read something that someone else believes in without having to negotiate vetoes with a bunch of stakeholders. You say, it's mine, I'm going to take this risk. No one believes in that, to hell with them. And that's the greatest justification of absolute property.
Yeah.
But it's completely different to say, therefore, it should be the only way in which economic decentralization is organized. Because there are all sorts of other contexts in which you should say, you could say, we would want there to be a superimposition of claims on resources, my tiers of stakeholders. So not just workers and investors, but local communities, local governments, and so
The
forth.
absolute would just be the lowest end of that spectrum where you're really the only stakeholder. But it could be like a gradient versus
That's right.
absolute.
So you say there, that's the idea that the normal form of economic decentralization is a form that does not entrust its future to absolute ownership, but admits of the coexistence of different states coexisting on the same collective resources.
I think in the context of land, I was just thinking of how like, and this wouldn't even be capital, but just like how absolute ownership of like, you know, your home could coexist with like a solution for like common ownership of things that aren't like your home would like decrease absenteeism and speculation of like housing and stuff like that.
Well, many of these debates, as I implied during the class, many of these debates were prefigured by the historical debates about agrarian, because there were all these problems arose. You distributed the land, and then there was land concentration. Should you impose restraints on alienation?